When Miss Frumkin became upset, she took her clothes off, refused to go to bed, banged on many of the doors in the ward, and spent the night singing, laughing, and talking to herself. Once, Miss Frumkin talked for an hour non-stop. One of her soliloquy, delivered at Indianapolis 500 speed, was peppered with the names of actors, television stars, pop and rock stars, as well as with brand names: Darth Vader, Elvis Presley, John Travolta, Roald Dahl. For several minutes, she was a perpetual motion machine, marching, paving, jogging, and trotting all over the ward. And she ran down the long corridor and then ran back. Miss Frumkin believed that Paul McCartney had fallen in love with her and was no longer in love with Linda, his wife. And she also demonstrated loosening of association, circumstantiality, labile emotions, delusions of reference, paranoid ideas, anger, hostility, flight of ideas, inappropriate affect, fragmented thoughts. Sylvia Frumkin is the protagonist of Susan Sheehan's classical book on schizophrenia titled Is There No Place on Earth for Me? Hello, I'm Ibrahim Imam, and welcome to another episode of the Neurology Lounge podcast, which will be exploring this singular mental illness that is schizophrenia. In his excellent book titled The Disordered Mind, What Unusual Brains Tell Us About Ourselves, psychiatrist and Nobel Prize winner Eric Kandel traced the history of our scientific understanding of schizophrenia to the French physician Philippe Pinel. He said Pinel formally founded the field we now call psychiatry in 1790. He added that Pinel insisted that psychiatric disorders are not moral disturbances, but medical diseases, and that psychiatry should be considered a subdiscipline of medicine. Kandel, however, regretted that no further progress was made in understanding psychiatric disorders until the early 20th century. This was when he said the great German psychiatrist Emil Kraepelin founded modern psychiatry. He wrote that Kraepelin thought that all mental illnesses have a biological origin, and that this belief led him to establish a modern system for classifying mental illness, a system that is still in use today. Arguing that Kraepelin's influence cannot be overstated, Kandel explored how he divided the major psychiatric illnesses into disorders of mood and disorders of thought, and how he referred to the latter as dementia praecox, the dementia of young people. It was, however, another psychiatrist who had to refine this concept. Kandel wrote that the Swiss psychiatrist Eugene Bleuler almost immediately took issue with the term dementia praecox, arguing that dementia was only one component of the disease. For this and other reasons, Kandel said Bleuler called the disease the schizophrenias, adding that he saw schizophrenia as a splitting of the mind, a disorientation of feelings from cognition and motivation, and that he used the plural noun to recognize the several disorders embedded in this category. It is in this context that Kandel asserted that Bleuler's ideas are fundamental to our understanding of the disease, and his definition still holds today. With this historical background, let us come back to the lived perturbations of schizophrenia with another classical, and this time a first-hand account of schizophrenia, and that is of Ellen Sachs, titled The Center Cannot Hold, My Journey Through Madness. Sachs said that the very first inkling of her schizophrenia was when she became somewhat quiet and withdrawn. Referring to this as the beginning of her estrangement from the world, she wrote that it all began one morning in class when she said, "I suddenly decided that I needed to get up, leave school, and walk home." Home was 3 miles away. And as she went, she said, I began to notice that the colors and shapes of everything around me were becoming very intense. Then she said the houses she passed started to send messages to her, putting ideas into her head. Sachs went on to have further isolated and self-limiting episodes until she went to Oxford University, where she said she grew steadily more isolated. This was when she began to mutter and gesticulate to herself as she walked in the streets, and she started to have difficulty distinguishing what was real from what was not. Her thoughts then became disorganized, and she said, I began to stammer severely to the point where I could barely finish a thought. No one could stand to listen to me talk. And then she said, in my fog of isolation and silence, I began to feel I was receiving commands to do things, such as walk all by myself through the old abandoned tunnels that lay underneath the hospital. The voices also commanded her to hurt herself, which she did by burning herself with cigarettes, lighters, electric heaters, and boiling water. Other symptoms Sachs detailed were delusions, including Capgras syndrome, believing that somebody close has been replaced, and hallucinations. Schizophrenia usually starts in late adolescence or early adulthood, and there may be a prodrome of abnormal beliefs and auditory hallucinations. It is slightly more frequent in males, in migrants, and in those living in urban areas. The environmental risk factors for schizophrenia include advanced paternal age, childhood adversities, and adolescent cannabis use. There are also perinatal risk factors, which include maternal infections, especially with toxoplasmosis, maternal stress, intrauterine growth retardation, complicated births, and preeclampsia. The onset of schizophrenia, however, varies quite remarkably. For Laurie Schiller, for example, it started with unusual mood changes, which she documented in her illness memoir titled The Quiet Room, A Journey Out of the Torment of Madness. Schiller wrote of how things began to change when she was 17 years old. She said, at first the change was pleasant. Somehow, without my quite knowing why, everything seemed much nicer than it had been before. It was only later that she said, gradually my mood began to shift and the brightness of the world began to darken, and she became racked by unhappy thoughts and unable to sleep. It was only later that Schiller experienced auditory hallucinations when she said voices started to tell her she must die, commanded her to hurt others, and laughed at her. She then said the voices evolved into a full-scale illness. What she said snatched from me my tranquility, sometimes my self-possession, and very nearly my life. Amongst her other symptoms were perceiving objects around her as hostile, seeing Walter Cronkite giving her instructions via the television, and having her thoughts becoming increasingly confused and poisonous. And she thought more and more about hurting herself. Sachs mainly displayed the positive symptoms of schizophrenia. These include delusions, hallucinations, disorganized behavior and speech, lack of insight, ideas of reference, suspiciousness, and thought echo, thought insertion, thought withdrawal, thought broadcasting, and alienation. Schizophrenia may, however, manifest with negative symptoms, which include a blunted affect, anhedonia, which is a reduced feeling of pleasure, avolition, which is a reduced goal-directed activity, alogia, reduced content of spoken words, as well as social withdrawal and self-neglect. Schizophrenia may also be comorbid with such disorders as anxiety, depression, and obsessive-compulsive disorder. A memoir that demonstrated an extreme manifestation of schizophrenia, one accompanied by significant threats of injury and death, is that of Henry, as narrated by his father, journalist Patrick Cockburn, in the memoir titled Henry's Demons. Cockburn wrote that the early warning signs of Henry's mental illness included walking barefoot and climbing viaduct walls. Henry also became wary of anything mechanical or electronic, such as watches and mobile phones, and was suspicious that the smoke alarm in one corner of his room was monitoring him. Things came to a head when Henry swam, fully clothed, in the near-freezing waters of New Haven estuary, and only saved from near-certain death by the local fishermen who rescued him. This was just one of countless episodes in which the police were called and Henry needed admission into a psychiatric hospital. Henry's schizophrenia was also characterized by what his father referred to as messiness. For example, he said Henry's room was an appalling mess even by adolescent standards, with empty coffee cups, discarded takeaway meals, and dirty clothes all over the floor. He added that his illness will come to be associated with mess, not just untidiness, but an attraction to detritus, to smelly alleyways and heaps of rubbish, and he became averse to cleanliness or orderliness of any kind. He went further to say Henry stopped shaving or washing his hair, and he soiled his jeans more than once and exhibited growing signs of infantilism, and he prefers to urinate out of doors if possible. Other very dangerous things Henry did were climbing high buildings, walking near railway tracks, and running naked through the snow. Another unusual onset of schizophrenia was narrated by Anhild Loveng in the memoir titled A Road Back from Schizophrenia. Her symptoms began when she was around 15 years old, when she said, "I first started to be scared in middle school, suddenly feeling lonely inside and outside." She said she became increasingly insecure about whether or not I really existed, or if I was only a character in a book or a being someone had made up. She added that I was no longer certain of who was controlling my thoughts and actions. Was it me or was it someone else? It was later that she developed auditory hallucinations of non-existent characters and visual hallucinations of animals such as wolves, snakes, and crocodiles. The convergence of life events that trigger the onset of schizophrenia is vividly portrayed by Douglas Goncalves in his illness memoir titled A Journey Through a Psychotic Breakdown. Goncalves manifested with a variety of paranoid thoughts, such as being the victim of an international plot led by Afghans under the coordination of Osama bin Laden. He believed that during his trip to Israel and Egypt years ago, someone brainwashed him, perhaps microchipped him, and instructed his subconscious to engage in terrorist acts years later. Goncalves looked back at the factors that he considered were the triggers of his psychosis. These included separating from his wife, what he referred to as a painful decision based on irreconcilable differences, also his favorite poodle being run over and then being dismissed from his job. He reflected that in less than 3 months, our friend was separated, devoid of whiskey, and available on the job market, whiskey being the name of his dog. There's also a familial tendency to schizophrenia, with many suggested susceptibility genes. For example, mental illness ran in Sheila's family, coming down her maternal line. Sachs also remarked that, as with many families, there is serious mental illness in my extended family as well. An unfortunate accompanying risk of schizophrenia is that of suicide. This was evident in the case of Sachs, who thought of death and suicide, and who became convinced that she was either evil or crazy. She also described the intense fantasies of how to kill herself, such as jumping into a river or setting herself on fire. It is remarkable that despite her crippling mental illness, Sachs made a success of her career. She eventually became professor of law, psychology, and psychiatry, and she argued that a mental illness diagnosis does not automatically sentence you to a bleak and painful life, devoid of pleasure or joy or accomplishment. Sheila was also able to overcome her illness and make a success of her life. She said, "Today, nearly 18 years after that terrifying summer, I have a job, a car, an apartment of my own. I am making friends and dating. I am teaching classes at the very hospital at which I was once a patient." Loving also successfully trained to become a psychologist. For many people, however, developing schizophrenia is a career-derailing event. This was the case with mathematical genius John Forbes Nash Jr., whose biography, titled A Beautiful Mind, was written by Sylvia Nasar. Nasar wrote that the first visible signs of Nash's slide from eccentricity into madness appeared when he was 30 and was about to be made a full professor at MIT. Describing the symptoms as cryptic and fleeting, she illustrated this with the time he walked into a common room one winter morning in 1959, carrying the New York Times, and he remarked to no one in particular that the story in the upper left-hand corner of the front page contained an encrypted message from inhabitants of another galaxy that only he could decipher. Nash suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, what Nasar referred to as the most catastrophic, protean, and mysterious of mental illnesses. Nasar chronicled Nash's early symptoms when she said he began to believe that a great many things that he saw, a telephone number, a red necktie, a dog trotting along the sidewalk, a Hebrew letter, a birthplace, a sentence in the New York Times, had a hidden significance. And at the same time, she added, he believed he was on the brink of cosmic insights. And by the time his illness became full-blown, she said it devastated his ability to do creative work, adding that his once illuminating visions became increasingly obscure, self-contradictory, and full of purely private meanings, accessible only to himself. She explained that the types of delusions that Nash suffered from are particularly characteristic of schizophrenia, both grandiose and persecutory, often shifting from one to the other in the space of moments, or even including both at the same time. The severity and persistence of his schizophrenia unfortunately led Nash to abandon mathematics and to embrace numerology and religious prophecy, believing himself to be a messianic figure of great but secret importance. Nasar said he became a sad phantom who haunted the Princeton University campus where he had once been a brilliant graduate student, oddly dressed, muttering to himself, writing mysterious messages on blackboards year after year. Making a diagnosis of schizophrenia entails excluding its close mimics. And the main mimics are bipolar disorder, major depressive disorder, schizoaffective disorder, schizophreniform disorder, and delusional disorder. It may also be mimicked by obsessive-compulsive disorder, substance misuse psychotic disorders, and post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. An illustration of how schizoaffective disorder mimics schizophrenia is the case of Esme Weijun-Wang, as she narrated in her memoir titled The Collected Schizophrenias. Wang wrote that schizoaffective disorder is the combination of schizophrenia with either mania or depression. She wrote that she was first diagnosed with bipolar disorder and was treated with mood stabilizers and antipsychotics for 8 years. It was after she said she began to truly fall apart, and then when she had switched to a new psychiatrist, that she was diagnosed as having schizoaffective disorder, bipolar type. Early in her disease, she experienced what she referred to as a series of repeated hallucinations of girls screaming for help outside my window. She also described a particularly bad episode when she said, I became manic, went a week without sleeping more than 2 or 3 hours a night, or without sleeping at all. Couldn't hold on to one thought without racing to another. scrawled ungrammatical nonsense in class, punched trees on cross campus. She then said that after the manias ran their course, I became immobile, depressed, suicidal. Another mimic of schizophrenia in the appropriate setting is post-partum psychosis. And a memoir that explored this disorder was Inferno, a memoir of motherhood and madness, written by Catherine Cho. Cho was 30 years old when she became pregnant. And when she delivered her baby boy, she said, I didn't feel a rush of love or an overwhelming weight of responsibility, emotions that I had been expecting. Instead, she said, I felt curious, like I'd just been introduced to a stranger. He was a creature, an idea, not even human yet, just a being, a life. Shortly after, she said she realized something didn't feel right. She said, I could hear a noise, a tiny buzzing and beeps that sounded like monitors, and thought the family was being watched. And then when she leaned to pick Kato, her son, she said his eyes turned to devil's eyes, dark eyes with flashing red pupils. Her paranoia of being watched worsened, and she proceeded to delete her Facebook and Instagram apps and her WhatsApp history because she thought they were watching them. She then said, I started to see demons' faces in the drugstore aisles. An older woman with a walking frame stared at me, and her face was distorted. And then she started experiencing auditory hallucinations, a voice in her head saying that her son has to die. We now come to the treatment of schizophrenia. But before exploring the contemporary armory, let us look back and see what the state of the treatment of schizophrenia was before. In his book titled Bedlam, Paul Chambers described the types of treatments meted to people with mental illness during Victorian times in the infamous Bethlehem Hospital in London. These included such barbaric measures as restraints, chains, handcuffs, cold baths, purgatives, bleedings, beatings, and caustic substances that would burn and blister the skin. In France, people with mental illness did not fare any better than they did in England. In his book titled Mad in America, Robert Whittaker wrote that prior to the French Revolution, lunatics had been treated with the usual neglect and brutality, saying that those who were manic were kept in chains and fetters, and all suffered the extremes of heat and cold in their miserable cells. He added that more than half of the men admitted to the asylums died within a year from starvation, cold, and disease. The earliest improvement in the approach to the care of people with mental illness came in 1793, when the French Revolution was raging. This was when Whittaker said that the seeds of moral treatment were planted, and this was when physician Philippe Pinel was appointed by the revolutionary government to tend to the insane at Salpêtrière and Bicêtre asylums in Paris. Whittaker wrote that Pinel was highly skeptical about the remedies prescribed in the medical text, and he found that they did little to help his patients, and that in place of such physical remedies, Pinel talked to his patients and listened to their complaints. Eric Kandel also said Pinel freed the mental patients from their chains and introduced humane, psychology-oriented principles that are a forerunner of present-day psychotherapy. The crusade for moral therapy was taken up in York, England by the Quakers after one of their members, Hannah Mills, died of ill treatment at the York Asylum in 1791. This episode led the group, led by William Tuke, to establish a York retreat in 1796. But Whittaker noted that even by the 1930s, things weren't really much better. He said at that time, psychiatric treatment was dominated by a quartet of therapies, which he listed as insulin coma, metrazole convulsive therapy, electroshock, and prefrontal lobotomy. So desperate was the need for effective psychiatric treatments at the time that the physician who introduced prefrontal lobotomy, Portuguese neurologist Egas Moniz, was rewarded with the Nobel Prize for his innovation. Whitaker traced the interesting journey of Moniz to his now infamous therapy. After a military coup ended his colorful political career as a member of parliament and as the Portuguese ambassador to Spain, Whitaker said Moniz turned his attention full-time to medicine and his neurological practice, and he set his sights on making a lasting contribution to medicine. Moniz, an ambitious physician, had twice missed out on the Nobel Prize after he was nominated for inventing a technique for taking X-rays of cerebral arteries. Obsessed with the prize, Whitaker said his chance came when he traveled in August 1935 to London to attend the Second International Congress in Neurology. Whilst there, he listened to a talk by Carlyle Jacobson, who detailed how removing the frontal lobes of chimpanzees produced a marked emotional change. 3 months after returning from London, Whitaker wrote that Moniz chose a 63-year-old woman from a local asylum to be his first patient. He described her as a former prostitute who was paranoid, heard voices, and suffered bouts of crippling anxiety. After his assistant, neurosurgeon Almeida Lima, performed 20 further operations, all within 3 months, Moniz declared the operation a success in subjects with manic depression. This opened the way to the use of the operation to treat people with depression and then later those with schizophrenia. It was the introduction of antipsychotics that completely changed the care of people with schizophrenia and somehow buried the old practices. And the history of the development of antipsychotics can be traced to the French chemist Paul Charpentier. Eric Kandel wrote that it was when he was working for the pharmaceutical firm Rhone Poulenc that Charpentier began to work on an antihistamine that he hoped would be effective against allergies, but without producing the numerous side effects of existing antihistamines. In this task, Charpentier developed chlorpromazine, also called Thorazine, and this was in 1950. Kandel said, as Thorazine went into clinical trials, everyone was amazed at its effect. It made people calmer, much more relaxed. The baton was then taken up by the French psychiatrists Pierre Denica and Jean Delay, who Kandel said decided to give the drug to their psychotic patients, and it turned out to be a magic bullet, particularly for their patients with schizophrenia. Paul Whitaker also noted the contribution of the French naval surgeon Henri Laborit in the history of chlorpromazine. Laborit, a year before Denica and Delay, had tested chlorpromazine on his surgical patients in 1951 and found that it induced a profound indifference. It is notable that according to Whitaker, Denica and Delay were responsible for coining the term neuroleptic in 1955 to describe the effect produced by chlorpromazine and the other phenothiazines that had been introduced. He explained that the word came from the Greek meaning to take hold of the nervous system, and that it was reflective of how the drugs were perceived to act as chemical restraints. After Sachs was eventually given a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia, she was started on treatment with the neuroleptic trilafon. She said after weeks of steady medication, the psychosis was beginning to lift, but despite this, she said she was attacked by my delusions, which swarmed thick and fast. She said while medication had kept me alive, it had been psychoanalysis that had helped me find a life worth living. Sheila, however, maintained that medication was the number one factor in her recovery, and clozapine was the agent that pulled her out of the depth of schizophrenia. The drug treatments of schizophrenia have advanced beyond the first generation and have gone on to the second and third generation antipsychotics. And the non-drug treatments include CBT, family therapy, and psychodynamic psychotherapy. In the next episode of the podcast in this theme, I will be speaking to Randy Kay to discuss her illness memoir titled Ben Behind His Voices. Thank you very much for listening to or watching this podcast. If you found it enlightening, why not like or subscribe to the YouTube, iTunes, or Spotify channels of the podcast. And whilst waiting for the next episode, why not consider checking out my book, Surfing the Brain, or my website called Neuro Checklist. Thank you very much for your time.